Welcome to Nicstalgia, your favorite pop culture podcast, where we have deep conversations about superficial things. I'm Nicole, your host, and each week we unlock core memories from the 90s, 2000s, and beyond while examining the past through a contemporary lens. Our guests are pop culture tastemakers who explore how our formative experiences shape how we see the world. We talk about trends, fashion, music, identity, consumer behavior, societal attitudes, and more. Nicstalgia is a reminder of how our individual and collective memories make us feel like we belong. And if you like Nicstalgia, be sure to follow, subscribe, rate, review, and share with a friend who loves pop culture as much as we do. Plus, we have a lot of fun. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Nicstalgia. I have Anna here with me today from This Must Be Pop podcast, and we have a lot of things in common, let me just say. We're going to talk about all things boy bands, JC Chasez, the list will just go on. Thanks, Anna, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I see you're wearing an NSYNC shirt. I also wore an NSYNC shirt for
yes,
this very purpose. This I got at a vintage market in New Haven, Connecticut, and it was $15. And I could just tell the guy selling it to me had no idea that he could have charged me $100 and I would have paid for it.
That's great.
Yes, it is it's from the let me see. It's from the 1999 World Tour, which I think my first concert ever was NSYNC, but it was in support of their No Strings Attached album.
Awesome. I feel like that was a lot of people's first concert experiences. So,
Yes.
my t-shirt is actually from the Forever 21 boy band collection from this year. I think it was also like $15 on sale, and it's like a cute black crop top, and I love it.
That's amazing. I am really going through a merch phase and a physical renaissance phase. So any kind of band, I've always loved band t-shirts, but now even just like hats, tote bags, and then now physical CDs and DVDs, they're just coming back into my life, and it's very exciting. It's very nostalgic.
Yeah. I've actually kept all of my CDs from when I was younger. So I recently went to my parents' house where they all were and just took all of, like, literally bags of them. And it's just so cool because I was like, I don't even know how much money I spent on all of these CDs, and they're like collector's items now. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, I actually went to New England's largest Christmas festival at Mohegan Sun, and there was a vendor there who was selling repurposed CDs. So these CDs and DVDs have unfortunately passed on to the next life. They are no longer usable as CDs, but he made them into coasters. And so I will show them to you because I have them right here. So it's a CD with a cork backing, which I'm like, that's a cool way to repurpose. I got Missy Elliott's This Is Not a Test, which I was not allowed to have as a child because it was parental advisory. Mariah Carey's Charm Bracelet, which recently had its anniversary, and Mariah tweeted, "Oh, if any of my charmies, remember." I'm like, who doesn't remember Charm Bracelet? But okay. Pink, Misunderstood.
Love that.
Lovely CD. And then lastly is Britney Spears' first CD.
Look at that. That's great. That's a great way to repurpose them.
I think so too. It's nice to have these things.
Yeah, and next time I'm totally going with you to this Christmas thing.
Oh my gosh, it was at Mohegan Sun, and so It was like an actual huge kind of convention center, and Mohegan Sun is nostalgic enough in just like all the concerts. Have you ever been there for a concert?
Not for a concert. I've just been, for friends' birthday parties and things like that. But I would love to go to a show there.
that is where I saw, speaking of NSYNC, that is where I saw Justin Timberlake perform Future Sex Love Sounds era.
Oh, great.
Yes, I remember.
Awesome.
Yeah, I remember we had seats that were in the first section, not on the floor, and when the opening act, so Good Charlotte had opened for them, when they walked by, when Timbaland walked by, Justin ended up walking by, you could reach out and they'd grab your hand or whatever, and it was a very fangirl moment. I've now seen both Justin Timberlake and Joel Madden out in public before, not at a concert, which is kind of surreal. And I think now, as an adult and like not in a fangirl context, it's definitely different. But I want to hear about your take on the whole kind of like idea of a fangirl, because your podcast exists and you're a music journalist as well. And, it's really about legitimizing this space. It's about not diminishing the, viewpoint of young girls. So I really wanted to hear about how you got into this niche specifically and what about it really inspires you to move forward.
Yeah, so I've always been a music nerd. I had a really unique upbringing. My parents were both very heavy into music. They were both into the punk and hardcore scene in the 80s and late 70s. And they've just always been, music collectors, record collectors, photographers, music photographers. And they have had passed down their love of music to me. And I've always just kind of been fascinated with people having a connection with music. And on top of that, growing up in the late 90s, the early 2000s, as you know, was such a unique moment in pop culture. Like there's never been anything like that to that, to that extent. And having punk rock parents during that time was really strange because, I literally grew up listening to the Ramones in my parents' minivan. And so there's this like weird dichotomy of them being parents in this time and then also having kids that were super into this like bubblegum pop stuff, which they obviously thought was a phase, but clearly it was not for me. So I've always just kind of been interested in, where pop music kind of lies within the rest of music in general. And I've always been interested in how, you probably experienced this because we're about the same age, growing up and seeing people kind of having their cliques around what music they were interested in, especially when you get to like high school and middle school. You had kind of the mainstream people, but then you had the alt rock kids, you had the punk kids, you had the goth kids. And, myself being a theater kid but I, also did sports and stuff. So I had always kind of connected with different groups of people and they all listen to different music. And I've just been the type of person where I've loved every single type of music, appreciated every single type of music, had a deep understanding of music history too. I've always kind of thought how weird it was how boy bands were always looked at differently. And basically during the pandemic, I revisited a lot of this music. I honestly hadn't kept up with a lot of the, updates to all of these bands, what they were doing. And obviously during the pandemic, I revisited a lot of this stuff and I was like, wow, this music was really legitimately good. And I feel like it hasn't been really appreciated in terms from a musical history standpoint. And on top of that, I also feel like the experience of being a fangirl or a fanboy or just a big fan of this music has often been overlooked in terms of its importance. And I started developing kind of the idea around this podcast, and I started really thinking about everything from like more of a feminist perspective, and how, you know, music journalism is overwhelmingly male in terms of how everything is framed. So I kind of wanted to reframe everything and talk about this experience of being a woman and being a young person, and how that experience is really relatable no matter what generation you're in, whether it's the Jackson 5, New Kids on the Block, NSYNC, or One Direction. You can always kind of see the similarities in the passion, and everyone just has their own story to tell. And every single one of these bands that I've done a deep dive on, every single one of them are so much better than I think culture and society gives them credit for.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I love taking that perspective too. I always call it viewing the past through a contemporary lens, because at the time it's so easy to kind of brush off the prevalence or prominence of boy bands as a fad or a passing trend. And yet, like you mentioned, for every generation, there's a band. And for whatever reason, the music, their choreography, their behind the scenes look at their life, like whatever the case may be, even how they look, whatever, picking your favorite boy band member, it can be as superficial as that if you want, or it can be very deep in, like, during the pandemic, my sister introduced me to BTS, and they like single-handedly lifted me out of a depression. Like, it can be that deep. And I think that, yeah, when you have such a male lens that truly dominates music journalism, it continues to, I think, it can be really tough to kind of shift that mainstream perspective. I even read a book that was a critique of Celine Dion, and it was basically like, okay, liking her music is in such bad taste. Why do millions upon millions of people go and see her show in Vegas, or like buy her records? Like, why is she sold 100 million records or whatever? It still came from a place of like putting it down, I suppose. And I liken being a Celine Dion fan to being the fan of like a losing sports team. You know, like when people like the same sports team forever, they never win a Super Bowl, and people kind of, you know, give you shit for it. And it's like, well, it kind of is what it is. And even I had seen a commentary on what Lance Bass had written in his, I think, 2007 memoir, where he was kind of rejecting the idea of having been in some kind of like prefabricated, superficial boy band. It's like he's rejecting the idea, but at the same time, you can tell that he very much internalized it and was therefore kind of fighting against this machine. I want to hear your thoughts about that kind of dichotomy too, where it's like the boy band machine makes people like very rich and or depending on who your management and your record label is, but like theoretically at least very famous, if not also very rich. And yet you don't get to be the kind of person or individual that you want to be. And if you show any kind of semblance of originality, it's like, no, go back to being the mold.
Yeah, and, you know, the exploitation, and, you know, especially since you're a BTS fan, you probably are very knowledgeable in kind of the exploitation aspect of the managers, the record companies, and how they kind of craft the whole entire image. But I think, I don't know, I think today, especially with social media too, you know, people can kind of see through if there's a fake image. I think people really gravitate towards authenticity, and when you have moments of that authenticity and they shine through despite all of the all of the crafted image, so to speak, I think that's what fans will gravitate towards, and they'll see that. So, you know, I think a lot about One Direction and kind of the transformation of Harry Styles, Louis Tomlinson, Niall Horan specifically, and how they've kind of changed and have evolved over time as artists, and kind of seeing not only their music but their image kind of changes. But that could also just be them growing up too. But they're definitely, they've been very open about their management being very strict with them, not doing it, not putting anything out there that would negatively impact the band. And I mean, yeah, there's a history to that, that relationship has existed for decades with boy bands. But like I said, despite all of that, fans connect with it. And I think that is part of the story that I feel is most important. And yeah, I just think that, there's the story from the fans' perspective that we should also be telling too. So
yeah, I think a lot about the fan perspective of sometimes when fans don't necessarily want to see even their favorite artists grow, evolve, or change. So if the band wants to go in a different direction, or if they want to experiment with a different sound, sometimes you'll see kind of that pushback, because in fandom it can kind of be like this bubble, and it's like the good days and you don't want things to change, and you feel like when a new era comes, okay, that's still within the bounds of your fandom's universe. And so I think that in that way, just not to be overly critical of fandoms, but like that's where you see that people kind of get stuck in one narrative, and then that's where they experience some friction, whether the band goes on hiatus or whether someone does break out on their own and go solo. There's so many implications where I think that there really is still an opportunity for fans to allow those artists to have that creativity. If they, like, some bands or some artists don't even get to the point in their career where they have that more of a free reign. Thinking of Harry Styles and Justin Timberlake as the best examples of that. But it's interesting.
It is interesting. And I mean, you kind of saw that, because I always try to take the conversation to NSYNC or JC wherever I can, but the celebrity album by NSYNC was very different sound-wise, and some fans didn't connect to it because it was very different than No Strings Attached. But kind of looking back on it, you realize how innovative that was. I mean, for them to work with BT on that album and kind of have this like EDM sound mixed with the boy band harmonies was super innovative for the time. And people don't, like, at the time, I don't think people really appreciated it. But you compare that with Backstreet Boys' Black and Blue album, which, if you look at the Backstreet Boys music compared to NSYNC's music, and we're just talking strictly music here, the Backstreet Boys collaborated with Max Martin predominantly throughout their first three albums. And by first three albums, I'm talking strictly US albums, because it gets complicated with the international releases. But you see Max Martin on 80% of those songs. With NSYNC, you see them collaborate with a lot more artists. Yes, there is Max Martin in a couple of songs in each album, but they work with Richard Marx, they work with Lisa Left Eye Lopez, like they're working with a lot of other people. And because of that, their sound, even though they only released 3 albums plus a Christmas album, their sound evolved so much in that time. Backstreet Boys, their sound pretty much remained the same for both Millennium and Black and Blue. There is a little bit of a progression there with their debut album, but I think that's kind of where you kind of see differences in the fan bases too, because at least in Backstreet Boys' prime, and I'm not talking about after 2005, but you don't really see that. There is a consistency there, and the fans were at that time were never like, oh, this sounds a little different. Maybe The Call is probably the one exception, but it's still a Max Martin song, like so.
It's super interesting because I've gotten to a point where I feel like I don't even necessarily compare Backstreet Boys and NSYNC anymore, just knowing that the money was going into the same pockets. I almost think of them as kind of like a little bit of overlapping Venn diagrams, with the late 90s and early 2000s being what is in the center. But I do think their paths are so different, because I did love Backstreet Boys too. I do think that, I mean, they formed earlier, and had Howie been in, okay, I'm not saying Howie wasn't in the right place at the right time, because he was still a part of Backstreet Boys and people would kill to be in his position. However, Howie, they had a very good documentary where Howie, because we're all thinking, wait, Howie's kind of like pushed to the background. He probably wanted to be front row center. And then in the documentary, he was like, I was pushed to the background. I wanted to be front row center. Hey, he could have been in Menudo. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he really could have taken a different path and saw his own star rise. Again, not saying he like made out badly, because he was in Backstreet Boys. He did just fine. But it's very interesting sound-wise, with them kind of having more of like this R&B sound to them toward the beginning. And then after kind of experimenting with this pop sound, just as it related to like the zeitgeist of the late 90s and that bubblegum pop explosion, that was just a really good ground for both Backstreet Boys and NSYNC to succeed. And I do think that that consistency, like for what Backstreet Boys lacked in, I don't know, that kind of like dynamicism of having different partners and collabs, I think that's what made them more maybe like palatable, because commercially they sold a lot more records than NSYNC did. They did. And I think that's, you know what I mean? If you relate to a broader group of people, like we're saying how most people don't like change that much. They like things to pretty much sound and stay the same. I think that's a good example for how, in contrast, the bands resonated with people. But yeah, NSYNC was, like, I'm the only one. I have my younger cousin and sister, and they both were 100% NSYNC. I listened to Backstreet Boys, but they really didn't. And the three of us, it was like NSYNC. So the Celebrity album that you mentioned, that was a really, really fun time. We were all between the ages of 10 and 13, and we would make music videos to every song, and we had the camcorder, and it was just like the absolute best time. At the time, I was actually a Team Lance girly, and
I was too.
Yeah, and since I just feel like, I say this all the time, I just feel like JC should have had a better publicist. His rocket ship could have really taken off in the early 2000s. I want to know, like, what's up with that? What do you think why JC didn't have the kind of solo career that Justin had, other than the fact that the manager who shall not be named was like biffs with Justin's mom?
So I think there's a few different reasons for it, and we dived into this in 2 episodes that we did specifically on JC. But I think one major thing is that he just didn't have backing from the label. Really, that's what it was. I think the second thing is, at that time, so, well, it depends on what era you're talking about, but specifically when it came to his album Schizophrenic, he did not have backing of the label, and there really wasn't much direction in the sound of the album. It seems like there wasn't really much oversight with the creation of the album, and the label was giving him creative control, but at the same time, when you're given too much control, there can be a lack of direction and cohesion. However, there is definitely much more cohesion with that album than in the second album that was never released. But the first instance, it was like more of an experimentation. It was he was kind of treating it as a side project. He thought that NSYNC would get back together. And he, in terms of the support of the label. It just wasn't there. And then you see how the label was promoted once it was released. And actually, going back to it, it was delayed like 9 months, after it was initially supposed to be released, and which is a red flag from the label. And then once it finally was released, the promotion, it was like the label didn't have an idea of who the audience was for that album too. This is a very experimental album. It's very kind of EDM pop, dance pop kind of thing. They're really trying to market to the NSYNC fans, which, were kind of in between the ages of 10 and 16. And the album was, very sexual, probably was meant for a little bit of an older crowd. But yeah, I think they're all of those things combined, specifically with Schizophrenic, that's what happened. And it seemed like with the story of Kate, what happened there was, I think the major thing was that the whole entire music industry was changing, and there just wasn't enough money. This was 2006, 2007. Illegal downloads were kind of at their highest during that time, and artists were getting dropped left and right. Even though it's so sad, because JC, for his second album, was working with a lot of really great producers and songwriters and collaborators, but they just didn't have the funding to keep him on the label, which is so sad. So that is why. And I think after that second album, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but I think after that second album, JC was just probably like, I'm giving up on being a solo artist. But kind of the cool thing that came about that is he's now a songwriter and producer for some incredible artists, lesser known artists, international artists. He's become kind of a mentor for some of these people too. He started his own girl group, Girl Radical. He seems to really enjoy being behind the scenes. So, good for him for that. And he's also working on a play. I don't know if it's going to be on Broadway or where it's going to be, but he's, doing music and being a playwright, which we can't wait for that to be released. But yeah, and what's kind of cool is actually for the podcast episode that we did, I created a Spotify playlist of all of not all, but most of the songs, at least the ones that were available on Spotify. All of the songs that JC Chasez has written and produced over the years that a lot of people don't know. And that playlist is like top 10% of all the user-created playlists on Spotify, which is pretty cool. So, yeah. So that's the story of JC, I guess.
That's very cool.
Yeah. In as short of time as I could possibly.
In a nutshell, that is the life story of JC Chasez.
His solo career. But yeah, so yes. So like I said, there's all these different reasons why his solo career did not pan out the way it was, or the way that it should have, like Justin did.
Yeah, and something else I see come up with fans that I'm not saying I'm against, but I am not one who immediately jumps to like a reunion scenario or a, all like reboots and things like that. A lot of the time they're just tired, and what we really need is maybe a one-time reunion, or just like how we saw during the pandemic, various casts of movies would get together and talk about it or something like that. I don't see bands reforming being like super productive necessarily, especially if they're super after the peak of their popularity. It comes off as a money grab a lot of the time to me. But I want to know what you think about reunions, coming back together for things, what that could look like, if that's even a possibility that you like seeing, or if there are other ways that going forward, people who either have nostalgia for NSYNC or boy bands, or as I call it, nowstalgia. Maybe you're a kid who was born in 2005. You're almost 18 now, and you want to listen to NSYNC. Like, what that experience can look like in the future without the band necessarily coming back to create new music.
Yeah, so I think it can be kind of complicated when it comes to reunions, especially if their careers outside of the band have been pretty successful. Yeah, and I mean, I would be, and it's also hard too because, I think people expect the world from these bands that kind of get back together to do like an album, a world tour, and a cruise, and people kind of expect them to be like New Kids on the Block, when really like that's New Kids on the Block, I have to commend them for how they do things, because they make sure to give themselves enough time in between tours and cruises and things like that, but they make sure to kind of give the fans what they want, but they don't overwork themselves at the same time. They really try to kind of like give themselves plenty of time and space in between everything. But at the same time, like, not every single band is New Kids on the Block. You're not going to be getting that amount of stuff. Like, I think they even have, the New Kids on the Block has like an app where fans can interact with them, and which is really cool. But most bands are not like that. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think it's more realistic in terms of like a reunion to have like a performance, or maybe like a Las Vegas residency or something. But it gets complicated too, because you obviously want, at least I do, I know we kind of talked about fandoms not wanting artists to grow and everything, but I think it's important to, and I also, it's good for their own creativity. I also think it's good for their mental health as well. You don't want someone to be kind of like stuck in doing the same thing night after night. You kind of see this, especially with the new Elvis movie that came out. You kind of saw how much of a toll it took on him. Mm-hmm. But that's just one example right there. But yeah, I think, having appearances here and there is nice. It's something that's good for the fans, and it also doesn't overwork them in a way, and it also provides them with the space to be able to do everything that they want to do on their own.
Definitely. Okay, I have one last question for you. What do you kind of see the future of fandom looking like? Is it going to kind of continue on the same trajectory? I mean, we really haven't seen a major disruption in fandom since kind of the advent of social media, and I'm always looking ahead of the trend on the next iteration of the internet. And if we look back to the early internet days, people in our generation would still be writing fan letters that we would send in the mail to Lance Bass or whoever we wanted to get in touch with, and social media was the first time we ever had any kind of direct line of communication or connection in a way that hadn't existed before. I personally don't think that many bands like New Kids on the Block or like BTS will have actual apps where fans can really form micro communities with one another. A community contrasting to an audience as like members who actually have relationships with one another, not just being an audience member or a fandom member centered around that musical artist. I'm really curious as to what you think fandom will look like in the future, and what kind of, will boy bands be a thing of the future too?
I think boy bands are always going to be part of the music industry. It's history is bound to repeat itself. That's for sure. In terms of what boy bands and fandoms look like, it's hard to say. But the one thing that I do hope for in the future is for the experience and the music of boy bands to be a little bit more legitimized. We talk a lot about this on our podcast too, about how society often stigmatizes the music of boy bands because they're marketed to predominantly young women, and the tastes of young women are in our society have historically been looked down upon, as well as the tastes of LGBTQ folk as well. So I'm hoping that we have kind of evolved as in society to legitimize that experience a little bit. And I'm hoping that our podcasts and movies like Turning Red legitimize that entire experience and legitimize all, forms of pop music that are catchy and are liked by young folks. So I'm just thinking in terms of how culture is changing and evolving. Boy bands historically have been marketed strictly to women. And of course, LGBTQ folk have always supported them. It really came to light with One Direction, but LGBTQ folks have, you saw them within the fandoms of, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and all of the boy bands that came before it as well. So I think you're going to see more of these bands being marketed to other communities outside of just young women. And I think you're also going to see bands that are, more gender inclusive in terms of, how they're formed. That's my prediction. I don't know if that's going to happen, but just in terms of where society and culture is moving, I'm hoping that it moves in that direction.
Definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next time. Bye. That's a wrap for this week. If you like Nicstalgia, please connect with me on social, subscribe to the Nicstalgia newsletter at nicstalgia.substack.com, and follow, rate, review on your platform of choice. Everything's linked in the show notes, including where to find more about our guest of the week. Thank you so much for your support. And that was this week's episode of Nicstalgia.